Welcome, Torsten here, and today we're looking at one of my favorite products of all time, Ozone 9, which is specifically for mastering. So before you do anything, make sure you've got some good headphones or some studio speakers because the techniques we'll be looking at today are rather subtle. First, I'll be giving you a general overview of the interface. Next, we'll be doing a quick rough draft master just to make sure that you're oriented. And finally, I will be showing you my favorite 3 new features that were added in this latest edition of Ozone. But first, when you are ready to add Ozone to your production arsenal, make sure you check out the Warp Academy web store. Let's jump straight in. First, let's orient ourselves to this session. They don't get much simpler than this. We have one pre-mixed 2-track song that we're about to master, and one instance of Ozone which is currently loaded to the default preset, which is moderately passive. Looking at Ozone's interface, the first thing I like to highlight is that this latest version allows us to resize the interface. And there was much rejoicing. In the global control section at the top, you can perform tasks like naming this instance of Ozone after the song, engaging the master assistant, which we'll do here in a moment, selecting between presets, clicking undo, or opening up the undo history if we really screwed things up, changing Ozone settings from their default, and a quick link to Ozone's manual, which I highly recommend you take advantage of. The signal chain works much like Ableton's device chain in that the audio signal flows from left to right, so you can add different effects, and when you change the order of the effects, you change the order in which they are processing the incoming signal. The I/O panel is where the input and output meters live. We can also adjust the input signal if it's coming in just a little bit too hot. At the bottom section, we have a bypass button. This allows us to hear the original track without any processing. Also, if you turn the gain match on, Ozone will match the volume of the bypassed version to compensate for the fact that your mastered version will likely be much louder. The sum to mono button allows us to listen for potential problems in that way. We can switch the left and right channels and preview various codecs. For example, what happens if we know somehow that this is going to get shared as an unreasonably small MP3? Listen to that snare get destroyed. Here's a brilliant feature. You can select reference tracks and toggle them off and on to check your work against already mastered songs. And finally, we can apply dither, which is definitely a concept for another video unto itself. Now, the very first step when you start mastering is to bypass all of the effects on your mastering chain and listen to the 2-track and try to understand what the artist was trying to convey in the mix that they sent to you. I'm only going to do this for a few seconds since I don't want to bore you on screen with an entire playthrough of this song, but do listen to the entire track when you are mastering for yourselves. Now, this track won't win any awards, but I did build it with your feedback in mind from many of our previous mastering tutorials. I pulled together a few loops from Black Octopus that I feel highlight the techniques we're exploring most effectively and hopefully make them somewhat less subtle, which of course was the feedback that we received. Mastering is very subtle. So now that we've listened to the track, I'm going to engage Master Assistant, which is a very handy tool, to help us get a good jumping off point for our mix. I want this to be a vintage mix, so for the modules, I'm going to use the vintage modules. For the loudness and EQ, I'm not going to use a reference, although I have one dialed up if I wanted to. I will manually choose a medium intensity to how it interacts with the loudness and EQ. In terms of how aggressively it tries to fix things. And ultimately, I will be using the streaming algorithm versus the CD algorithm since I want to play this track on Spotify. I click Next, And it's waiting for the audio, so I will return to 0 and play from the beginning. While Ozone analyzes this track, I will take the opportunity to remind that we have tons of new content already in production. So if you are enjoying this video, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. So here we have the suggestion that Ozone has come up with. I will click accept, and we see it's added a series of modules here at the top. Let's start from the left and move to the right and see what it did and see if we like what we have. I'll click here to solo out the equalizer. We see that it's boosting in the mids, cutting the highs. Again, super subtle. The vintage EQ looks like it's really not doing too much at the moment, but if we wanted to boost the lows, for example, we could add a little boost there. We also want to do a little bit of low cut probably. There's no way I'm going to get into how to use a Pultec style EQ module, although it's gorgeous. The vintage compressor is currently bypassed, but it placed it in a position that might be useful to us if we did want to use it. So let's say we did. We can engage that. Again, I have nothing soloed, so these are all of the modules being used together, and that's generally how you want to master. And let's put this a little higher, the threshold a little bit higher. I like it at smooth, that's pretty good. Slightly higher ratio, get a little more breathing there. I'm happy with that. All right, vintage limiter. This is different than the maximizer in the way it interacts with the source audio. And let's change this to tube. Kind of like what that's doing to the kick. And finally, we have the maximizer. So let's hear before and after. Now, I want to emphasize very briefly the gain match. So here I'm going to click gain match, and what this does is it will turn up the bypassed version to be of a similar loudness to the now mastered version so that we can hear the differences, not just in loudness, but specifically the differences in the EQ and the compression that we applied, so that the general characteristics will be more obvious to us. So let's listen to that now. Now, this creates an excellent opportunity for me because the first thing I noticed listening to the pre-mastered version and our pseudo-mastered version is that the bass has changed in its characteristic dramatically. And when I listened, like I told you to do, to the track originally, the impression I got was that the artist is trying to convey an emotional story using this instrument. Therefore, my mastering is starting to deviate from what the artist intended. So I would go back and change some of the module settings to make sure that I continue to capture that feel that the artist put into their track. I'll go ahead and play the track one more time so you can hear the bypass version and the mastered version and see what I'm talking about. So now that we're feeling oriented with Ozone, let me get rid of the modules that we have, and I can show you the 3 new features that they added within Ozone 9. First, let's take a look at Match EQ. This is a very cool module that allows you to capture a reference track's sonic characteristics in terms of its highs and lows, etc., and apply it to our track, which will also be analyzed using the capture buttons. This one's for reference. This one will be our track so that we can apply the EQ to our track. But first, let's get another track in here that we can apply or that we can analyze as a reference track. So I'll go ahead and solo this new track out. And what you want to do is take the original version, the original instance of Ozone, and drop it onto the new track. We'll open that back up so we can see inside, and we'll click Capture under Reference. We're capturing the reference track. Simply click play and let it do its thing. Again, I would tend to listen to the entire track, but this is a good enough version. We can see that we've captured a sonic profile, based on the other track. We'll now drag it back to the track that we're mastering. We no longer need this reference track, so I'm just going to delete it. And we open Ozone again to see that the captured reference is still there. We're going to capture our Apply To track by clicking Capture and playing the audio. And we see that it's creating a new profile based on the Apply To track. And I'm just trying to get a good enough version here, so that should be enough. Now, what if you didn't have a track to reference? For example, I will go ahead and click Clear here, and we can see that you can load presets by clicking this icon, which is located right here. And in this case, let's use the vocal-centric EDM preset that comes with Ozone. Oops, and I forgot to click Stop on the Apply To. So let's take a look at the two controls that we have once we have our profiles. First, we have Amount on the far right. As you can see indicated by the white line here, this is the amount of EQ that is actually being applied to our track, pulling it towards the reference track. And generally, you want to keep this below 65%, otherwise it's far too much. Next, we have Smoothing. This actually creates individual bands of EQ that are being turned up or down, as we see here. And again, you don't want too many, so generally you want to keep it around 35 to 50%. Now what I like to do is turn the amount all the way down and gradually turn it back up until I achieve the desired sound I'm looking for. Now it's pretty subtle, but let's listen to before and after. Now this effect is definitely a bit too much for my lows and highs, so I can omit those sections by dragging here. And now we're just processing the mid-range. And I will A/B again, and we hear that the mix is now much more balanced. And that's it. Match EQ is powerful, elegant, and I think very easy to use. So let's move on to our next module, Low End Focus. The low end of a mix is notoriously difficult to mix and master, and this specific module is designed to add separation between elements in the low frequency range. So let's pretend I'm actually mastering, therefore I'm not going to keep this module soloed because I want to hear it in context of the match EQ. And let's go ahead and play the audio and solo out the lows right here. And we hear I'm getting some of the vocals in there, so I want to make sure we filter those out. And we'll turn solo off so we can hear the effect in context of the track. We have three primary controls: the contrast slider, the punch and smooth selector, and a makeup gain slider. Now let's focus on the contrast control, and as I drag it up, pay attention to the separation we achieve between the kick and the bass. And we blend them if I drag it down past 0. Double click to reset. Now let's listen to the smooth mode. It's similar, but much more subtle. I'm actually digging the punchy version, and it's pumping and breathing, but we probably should bypass the effect to make sure we don't need to compensate for some changes in volume. To avoid overdoing this effect, let's use the listen function to hear what we're actually removing from the mix. But what if the bass is just a bit too loud? Well, let me introduce you to our next and final module for the day, Master Rebalance. Now this allows us to take either vocals or bass or drums and turn them up or down in context of the rest of the track. Let's assume that the vocals are just a bit too quiet. Or we can turn them down significantly. It's almost like having a fader on the original mix. Let's try bass next. And finally, let's listen to the drums. So there you have it, a decently robust overview of Ozone 9 and my favorite 3 new features that they added. Again, if you're looking to pick this up for yourself, please check out the Warp Academy web shop. We'll see you in the next video.